In this block study video, we're going to be tackling this really lovely Mississippi Star block. We'll be making it in two sizes, the 12-inch version as well as this really large 27-inch fat quarter friendly block. We'll be making half square triangles and then snowballing the corners. There are some options for block layout, and then we'll talk about some quilting options at the end. So it's time to make our block. I'm going to be making the 12-inch version of this block today, and it just so happens that the layer cake measurements for this block work out to 12 inches. So the layer cake version and the 12-inch version are interchangeable. The only real note here is that the layer cake version, you get enough pieces from the two layer cake squares to make two blocks. So you'll notice a little bit of difference in the cutting instructions. The layer cake cutting instructions include twice the background pieces as the 12-inch version because you're making two blocks. So I have all my pieces cut for the 12-inch version, and I'm making it in this lovely blue and green. So let's get started. The basic construction for this block is a 9-patch. 5 of these squares of our 9-patch are going to be just solid fabric. So super simple, super easy. You cut them, they're ready to go. The other 4 pieces, these side units, are going to be 2 at a time half square triangles, at least so far. So I have 2 5-inch background squares and 2 5-inch color B squares to make our half square triangles. Half square triangles are a really useful unit. They pop up in a lot of blocks, and so being able to make them in a variety of different ways is really helpful. Today we're going to make 2 at a time half square triangles, which is a very simple method. We're going to take our 2 squares and put them right sides together and draw a line from corner to corner. I generally draw the line on the lightest fabric since your pen shows up more nicely there. Now I'm using a friction pen here to draw the lines on my half square triangles. I really like these pens because they do disappear with heat. I don't think they completely are removed from your fabric, and they can. Certain people have reported that they come back if your fabric gets too cold. So I wouldn't use these on a surface of a quilt, but for marking, cutting, or sewing lines, I use these all the time because they do write really well on fabric. They glide really nicely. Now, I'm using these pens to mark on light fabric. If you are using dark fabric, like this navy blue, then try to find these silver metallic pens. These are really easy to find kind of over the holiday season because people use them to write on gift tags. But these are great because they leave a really easy to see line on your dark fabrics. So these are awesome. I've used about half of this one so far, so I need to get another one. The gold works pretty well as well, and they are permanent. Don't use it on the surface of your quilt, but for marking lines, these are awesome. I'll put a link to the brand that I use in the description below, or you can find it on my Amazon page. But it's just the Uniball Gel Metallic Pens. After you mark your diagonal line from corner to corner on the back of your fabric, it's time to sew 1/4 inch on either side of the line. Now, as with all of my patterns, there is a little bit of trimming room built into these half square triangle units. They are a bit oversized, so once we sew and press them open, we'll be able to trim them down to perfect size. Now that we have both lines of stitching done, we can cut on our original marking line. So I'm going to press these and then trim them down to 4.5 inches. You can press your seam allowances however you like. I'm going to press mine open, but there aren't a lot of intersecting seams in this block, so if you prefer to press to the side, this is a great opportunity to do so. For trimming half square triangles, I love to use a rotating cutting mat. It just makes life a little bit easier. I'm using my 4.5 inch square ruler since these are 4.5 inch square block units. So I can just align the diagonal line along that seam line, cut around these 2 sides, and then rotate this without moving anything, and then get those last 2 sides. And there we go, a perfect unit. Now that we have our half square triangles all trimmed, perfect size, it is time to add our little accent squares. Now there are 4 2-inch color A squares in the cutting instructions. We are going to snowball these on the corner of our half square triangles, on the print side of the half square triangles. So to do this, all we're going to do is lay our 2-inch square, our small square, in the corner of our half square triangle, and again draw a line from corner to corner of that 2-inch square. Now we are going to sew almost on this line. When you are snowballing corners, if you sew just a small thread width to the outside of that line, it's going to give you a more straight corner when you do fold that snowball corner back onto itself and press it open. If you have ever snowballed a corner and when you press it open, it's just a little smaller than the corner it replaced, then try sewing just that little thread width to the outside of that line, and that will give just a little bit of extra room to account for the space that's taken up in the folding of the fabric. So I'm going to sew just a little bit to the outside of this line. So here is my drawn marking line, and you can see my stitching line is just barely to the outside of it. And that tiny bit of space is going to allow me to fold this back and have a really nice straight corner. So after you sew that line, you can simply cut off the excess. You can do this with a rotary cutter or a pair of scissors. And now we're going to press this open. So I went ahead and I sewed one on the line just to show you kind of what I was talking about in that kind of folding extra thread width of fabric. So this is the half square triangle I originally sewed, where I sewed a thread width outside of the marked line. And so when we folded this back, this corner is nice and square. See how it fills that whole corner. Now this square I sewed right on the line. It's just a little short. So is this a big deal? Is that little bit of shortness gonna ruin your quilt? Absolutely not. You could very easily work this into the next seam allowance when you assemble this unit to its next unit or to the block that goes next to it. It's just something that you're going to have to remember and take into account in that step, to remember to pin that one down a little bit and not try to yank it up and make it all straight, because it's not straight. So you can easily fit it into the seam allowance. But it's something that you'll have to remember in that next step. And so if you can take care of it when you're making the block unit and not have to remember in that later step, that might not happen for a couple of weeks, then I feel like that's an advantage. It doesn't take any extra time or effort to sew that little bit outside that line, so I do. And then my blocks are nice and square and I don't have to worry about it in the future. But if you have a few blocks that turned out like this, a little bit short, don't rip them, don't redo them, just go with the flow. I'm gonna finish snowballing my corners and then it'll be time to assemble the block. So now that I have all of my snowball corners done on my half square triangle units, it's time to assemble our block. This is going to go together just like any normal 9-patch. I have my 4 kind of prepped units. I have 4 background squares, and then I have one 4.5-inch square of my color A, and that's going to go right in the center of our block. Now obviously the measurements for the different size blocks for the fat quarter will be a little bit different, but the layout will be the same. So let's lay these squares out. Your uncut color A square is going to go right in the center of our block. And then on the corners are our background squares. Now these units go kind of in the center of each side. And there are 2 different ways to arrange this block. You can have your block spiral around counterclockwise, or you can simply rotate all of these units 90 degrees and have your block spin clockwise. You can mix and match, you can make them all the same way. It's totally up to you, whichever way your star spins that looks good to you. I'm going to lay mine out just how we have here and sew it together. When I chain piece a 9 patch or a 4 patch or a 16 patch, I always start in the same place. I sew kind of the number 1 unit if you're working on a number pad to the number 2. I just take the number 2, put them right sides together, and pick it up. Make sure to remove all these little random threads. Now it's time to move over to my sewing machine, and if you're using a seam allowance guide and you had it off to do the snowballing and 2 at a time half square triangles, now's a good time to snap it back on. Having a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance when you're sewing is really important. It's how you're going to keep all of your points aligned and matching and not losing them in the seams. So when I move my seam guide, I always take just a minute and do a test. Now, if you've never done a seam allowance test or you don't know how, I do have a whole video on how to do a perfect 1/4 inch seam by making some simple changes to where your needle location is, or if you have a machine like mine and you can't move the needle, how to kind of adjust your seam guide so that you have perfect seam allowances without having to think about it too hard. So I'm going to grab some scraps and just do a little test right here to make sure that my machine is set up properly. Well, it took me a few tries, but my seam allowances are set now. So I'm gonna go back to my pieces here and sew this seam and start assembling this block. After I sew 1 to 2, I sew 4 to 5. And I'm just gonna work down these first 2 columns of the block, and then I'll add that 3rd column, and then I'll sew the rows together. Usually I like to press my seam allowances open, but when you have a block like this where the corners as well as the center are all a solid piece, then you can press your seam allowances to that solid piece and they will always nest. So when I go to sew these together, this seam allowance is pointing that way and this seam allowance is pointing that way. So they'll nest really nicely and reduce bulk. If you aren't sure how your blocks are going to come together, how you're going to join the later blocks, you can always take the option of pressing them open, and it's a little bit of an insurance policy. I know that this block is destined for a sampler quilt, and so there's probably going to be some sashing around it to make the blocks all the same size. So I'm going to go ahead and just press with this block in mind. So I'll be alternating my seam allowances. Now that we have finished our 12-inch version of our Mississippi Star block, it's time to talk about quilt layout. You have a myriad of options to make a quilt from this block. You could make all 12-inch blocks and have a nice, really classic layout. You could swap in the different rotation and have kind of a dancing stars look. You could also mix and match the different sizes. This large block is 27 inches and the small block at 12 inches, you could make multiple 12-inch blocks, put a little sashing between them, and bring that up to 27 inches so that you could have small stars interspersed with these really big stars. You could make just a few of the big stars for a throw, or you could make just a few stars and intersperse that with a lot of background fabric for a lot of negative space in your quilt. That would really help your prints shine and give you lots of room for quilting. There are a lot of ways to have fun quilting this block. I have drawn out a few of my ideas on a kind of line drawing of the star block, and it's in the downloadable pattern. There's also a blank kind of line drawing page for you to doodle on your own quilting designs. I found that these little kind of outer points of my stars were a great place to feature some border designs and then have some feature quilting in the center of the block. And then these large areas of background fabric are a great place to experiment with a large-scale quilting motif, like some large wavy lines with some filler between them. You could even do some fun feathers or really large-scale swirls, whatever really piques your interest. You could also do a simple meander in this outer portion, and that would really make your star designs pop. My Mississippi star blocks are destined for a sampler quilt that I am going to make with the rest of my block study blocks that I've been collecting throughout this year. If you have questions about how to assemble a sampler quilt made from blocks of different sizes, or kind of questions about how best to quilt a sampler quilt that has a lot of different block styles, then leave your questions in the comments below, because I'll be doing a whole video on that kind of early in the next year. So I look forward to incorporating as many questions as possible from you guys. I love sampler quilts, so I'm really excited about this. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another video. Until then, if you want to catch up on block study and see all the blocks we've made so far, there is a little list popping up on the screen right now that will take you to the playlist. And there's also a video that YouTube thinks that you will love popping up. So I will be back soon, and I hope you guys enjoyed this block. Happy quilting! The bacon construction.